Keanu Reeves inspires me because he carries profound loss with grace and transforms pain into kindness. He lost his daughter and the love of his life, yet instead of becoming bitter, he quietly helps others without seeking recognition. He takes public transportation, gives up his seat to strangers, and donates millions anonymously. His humility despite fame shows that true strength comes not from power or wealth but from how we treat others when no one is watching. He reminds us that the greatest warriors are those who conquer their own darkness and choose light. The rain in Seoul fell differently that night, each drop seeming to pause mid-air before touching the ground, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Park Jin-ho stood at his office window, watching the neon lights blur through the water-streaked glass, feeling a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Something was shifting in the air, a change he could sense but not name, like the moment before lightning strikes when the whole world goes electric and still. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window, a face that had commanded fear for 20 years, but tonight those eyes looked hollow, searching for something they had never needed before. The leather chair behind his mahogany desk creaked softly as his nephew Min-jun had sat there just yesterday, laughing about his university plans, his whole future spread before him like an unwritten book. Now that chair sat empty, the silence in the room so complete that Jin-ho could hear his own heartbeat, steady and relentless, counting seconds that might be running out. The call had come 3 hours ago, the voice on the other end mechanical and cold, demanding $10 million for Min-jun's safe return. Jin-ho had built an empire on reading people, understanding their weaknesses before they understood them themselves, but this voice gave nothing away, no tremor of greed, no hint of fear, just business-like certainty that made his blood run cold. His men had scoured the city, called in every favor, threatened every informant, but Seoul had swallowed his nephew whole, leaving no trace except that empty chair and the ghost of yesterday's laughter. Jin-ho moved away from the window, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet as he walked to his desk and picked up a photograph of Min-jun at his high school graduation, smiling with the kind of hope that Jin-ho had forgotten existed. The boy had never asked to be born into this life, never wanted the shadow of his uncle's reputation following him through university hallways where other students whispered and stepped aside. Jin-ho had promised his sister on her deathbed that he would protect her son, give him opportunities she never had, but what good were promises when you could not even find the one person who mattered most? His phone buzzed with a message from his lieutenant, telling him about an American actor spotted in the Gangnam district, someone famous who might have connections, might have money, might be convinced to help. The name meant nothing to Jin-ho until he saw the photograph attached, a tall man with kind eyes buying flowers from an elderly street vendor, counting out exact change like any ordinary person despite the designer clothes. Keanu Reeves, the message said, in Seoul for some charity work, staying at a modest hotel instead of the luxury suites his fame could command. Desperation makes men do things they would never consider in calmer times, and Jin-ho found himself studying that photograph like he had once studied rival gang leaders, looking for weakness, for leverage, for anything that might save Min-jun, but the man in the picture was not posing, not performing, just handing money to an old woman and accepting flowers with a slight bow that showed he had learned Korean customs. Something about that simple gesture, that unnecessary respect for a street vendor, made Jin-ho pause. The next morning found him at a small bookstore in Inspirational, a place he had not visited in 20 years but where his sources said the actor browsed poetry books each morning. Jin-ho entered with 2 of his men, their presence turning the peaceful shop into something tense, customers suddenly remembering appointments elsewhere. But there in the back corner, seemingly oblivious to the change in atmosphere, stood Keanu Reeves, reading a collection of Korean poems with the kind of focus that suggested he understood the language. Jin-ho approached with measured steps, his usual intimidation tactics ready, the script he had rehearsed playing in his mind about a business opportunity, an investment possibility, anything that might hook a wealthy American. But before he could speak, Keanu looked up from his book and smiled, not the practiced smile of a celebrity but something genuine and slightly sad. He held up the poetry collection and asked in surprisingly good Korean if Jin-ho had read it, his voice carrying no recognition of who Jin-ho was, no fear of the men standing behind him, just simple curiosity about a book of poems. The question threw Jin-ho completely off balance because no one had asked his opinion about poetry since his university days, before blood and power became his language. He found himself nodding, remembering late nights reading Kim's Seoul by candlelight, back when he still believed words could change the world. Keanu purchased 2 copies of the book, handing one to Jin-ho with that same gentle smile, saying that he looked like someone who carried heavy burdens and that poetry helped with weight that hands could not hold. Jin-ho took the book, feeling its slight weight, watching as Keanu bowed politely and walked past his men as if they were simply other customers browsing for morning reading. The actor paused at the door, turning back to add that he would be at the orphanage on Dongseung Street that afternoon if Jin-ho wanted to discuss Korean poetry further, then disappeared into the Seoul morning crowd, leaving Jin-ho holding a book of poems and wondering when he had lost control of the situation. That afternoon, Jin-ho sent his men to investigate this American actor who spoke Korean and visited orphanages, who bought poetry for strangers and seemed to see through expensive suits to something underneath. The reports came back stranger than fiction, tales of Keanu helping in soup kitchens without photographers present, teaching martial arts to troubled youth in neighborhoods even Jin-ho's men avoided after dark, sitting with homeless veterans and listening to their stories over shared bottles of soju. The orphanage on Dongseung Street was a rundown building that Jin-ho had passed 1,000 times without noticing, its faded sign barely visible between a convenience store and a mobile phone shop. Inside, he found Keanu sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by children who were showing him their drawings, their voices high and excited as they explained each colorful detail. When Keanu saw Jin-ho in the doorway, he simply patted the floor beside him in invitation, as if Mafia bosses regularly joined story time. Jin-ho found himself sitting on that hard floor, his expensive suit gathering dust, watching this Hollywood star help a 7-year-old girl sound out difficult words in a picture book. The children seemed completely comfortable with Keanu, climbing on his back, tugging at his sleeves, treating him like a favorite uncle rather than a celebrity. One boy with a scar across his cheek, the kind of mark Jin-ho recognized from street violence, brought Keanu a drawing of a superhero, explaining earnestly that it was him because he saved people in movies. Keanu studied the drawing seriously, then told the boy that real heroes were people who chose kindness when the world gave them reasons to be cruel, who protected others even when they were scared themselves. His eyes found Jin-ho's across the circle of children, holding that gaze as he added that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was ask for help when someone they loved was in danger. The words hit Jin-ho like a physical blow because somehow this stranger knew, had seen through his visit to the bookstore, understood the desperation that had driven him to seek out a foreign actor. After the children went for their afternoon snack, Keanu and Jin-ho sat in the small courtyard behind the orphanage, Seoul's noise muted by concrete walls covered in more children's artwork. Keanu spoke first, his voice quiet but direct, saying he knew about Min-jun, knew about the kidnapping, had heard through his network of social workers and former gang members who now ran youth programs. Jin-ho's first instinct was suspicion, wondering what angle this actor was playing, what price would come with his help. But Keanu continued, sharing his own story of loss, speaking about his daughter who died at birth, his partner who followed soon after, the darkness that had threatened to swallow him whole. He talked about learning that grief was not something to overcome but something to carry, and that the weight became bearable when you used it to understand other people's pain. He offered to help find Min-jun not with money, which the kidnappers already demanded, but with connections to people who knew Seoul's hidden corners, former criminals who had found redemption and now worked to save others from their old life. Jin-ho wanted to refuse, his pride rebelling against accepting help from an outsider, but the clock was ticking and his own networks had found nothing. He agreed, watching Keanu make phone calls in a mixture of English and Korean, arranging meetings with people whose names Jin-ho recognized, young men who had once worked for rival gangs but now ran after-school programs in drug rehabilitation centers. Within an hour, they had leads that Jin-ho's threats had not uncovered, whispers of suspicious activity in warehouses by the Han River. The night stretched long as they followed those leads, an unlikely pair moving through Seoul's underbelly, the mafia boss and the movie star united by desperation and hope. Keanu's contacts provided information freely, not from fear but from respect, because he had helped their programs, believed in their redemption when society had written them off. Jin-ho watched these interactions with growing amazement, seeing hardened former criminals open up to Keanu like flowers to sunlight. At 3 in the morning, in a coffee shop that never closed, run by a woman who had lost her own son to gang violence, they finally got solid information. Min-jun was being held in an abandoned textile factory in Sangdong district, but the real shock came with the identity of his kidnapper. Jin-ho's own lieutenant, Kim Tae-sun, the man he had raised from the streets, trained, trusted with his life, had orchestrated everything to take over the organization. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound because Jin-ho had been a father figure to Tae-sun, had paid for his education, attended his wedding, held his firstborn child. But power corrupts in predictable ways, and Tae-sun had grown tired of being second, had decided that kidnapping Min-jun would either bring him $10 million or force Jin-ho into a mistake that would topple his empire. The irony was bitter, that Jin-ho's skill at reading people had failed him with the one person closest to his operations. They drove to the factory in silence, Jin-ho's men following in black cars, weapons ready for the bloodbath that seemed inevitable. But as they parked outside the rusted gates, Keanu placed a hand on Jin-ho's arm, suggesting something that sounded insane in the moment. Instead of going in with guns blazing, risking Min-jun's life in crossfire, what if they tried talking first, appealing to whatever humanity might remain in Tae-sun, reminding him of who he used to be before ambition poisoned his heart? Jin-ho wanted to laugh at the naivety, wanted to explain that his world did not work on words and second chances, but something in Keanu's eyes stopped him. This was a man who had every reason to embrace darkness after his losses but had chosen light instead, who helped orphans and gang members alike because he believed people could change. Maybe that belief was foolish, but Min-jun was running out of time and conventional methods had failed. They entered the factory together, Jin-ho's men spreading out to cover exits while Keanu walked beside him through machinery covered in decades of dust. They found Tae-sun on the main floor, Min-jun tied to a chair but apparently unharmed, though his eyes widened with relief when he saw his uncle. Tae-sun had his own men, weapons drawn, the scene set for the kind of violence that would leave no winners, only different degrees of loss. Jin-ho felt his hand moving toward his weapon, muscle memory taking over, but Keanu stepped forward with his hands visible and empty. He spoke to Tae-sun not as a hostage negotiator but as someone who understood the weight of choices, the way ambition could twist love into something unrecognizable. He talked about Jin-ho's early days, stories he had learned from their night of searching, how Jin-ho had found Tae-sun beaten nearly to death in an alley, had nursed him back to health, given him purpose when the world had thrown him away. Tae-sun's expression flickered between anger and something else, memories perhaps, or recognition of the man he had been before greed rewrote his priorities. Keanu continued, his voice steady and without judgment, painting a picture of two futures, one ending in blood in prison, the other in forgiveness and new beginnings. He spoke of redemption not as weakness but as the ultimate strength, the courage to step back from a cliff edge even when momentum wanted to carry you over. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of Seoul waking up, traffic beginning to flow on nearby highways. Jin-ho found his voice, speaking directly to Tae-sun for the first time in hours, not as a boss to a traitor but as a man who had failed to see the ambition growing like cancer in someone he loved. He apologized for creating an empire built on fear, for teaching Tae-sun that power came from violence, for not showing him that there were other ways to build a life worth living. Min-jun made a sound behind his gag, and that small noise seemed to break something in Tae-sun. His weapon lowered slightly as he looked at the boy he had watched grow up, who had called him uncle at family gatherings, who represented a future that could still be different from their past. The standoff stretched, balanced on a knife edge between redemption and revenge, until Tae-sun finally dropped his weapon completely, his shoulders sagging with the weight of choices that could not be undone but perhaps could be forgiven. The aftermath happened quickly, Tae-sun's men surrendering without their leader's will to drive them, Min-jun freed and clinging to his uncle with tears streaming down young cheeks. But instead of the violence that should have followed betrayal in their world, Jin-ho did something unprecedented. He offered Tae-sun a choice to leave with enough money to start over, to find a life outside the shadow of organized crime, to become the man he might have been if circumstances had been different. Keanu helped facilitate this exit, connecting Tae-sun with programs in Busan that helped former criminals build legal businesses, offering a second chance that the man had not earned but might grow to deserve. Watching Tae-sun leave, shoulders bent with shame but steps growing steadier with each meter from his old life, Jin-ho felt something shift inside his chest, a door opening that he had welded shut decades ago. The sunrise over Seoul painted the city in shades of gold and possibility as Jin-ho made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. Standing in that abandoned factory with Min-jun safe beside him and Keanu watching with those endlessly compassionate eyes, he announced to his assembled men that their criminal empire would transform into something else. The money they had accumulated through fear would build legitimate businesses. The network they had created through violence would become a support system for those trying to escape gang life. The transition was not simple or quick, but Keanu stayed to help, using his connections and reputation to open doors that would have remained closed to a former crime boss. Jin-ho sold his weapons operations and invested in construction companies that hired ex-convicts. His drug networks became distribution channels for legal goods, employing young men who might otherwise have no options beyond crime. The protection money he had collected transformed into venture capital for small businesses in poor neighborhoods. 6 months later, the bookstore where they had first met hosted a grand opening as a community center. The same shelves that had held poetry now offered free tutoring for at-risk youth, job training for former gang members, counseling for families torn apart by violence. Jin-ho stood before a crowd that would have scattered in fear months ago, holding the poetry book Keanu had bought him, its pages soft from reading. He spoke about transformation, about how a stranger's kindness had shown him that strength lay not in the ability to instill fear but in the courage to inspire hope. The children from the orphanage were there, still drawing superheroes but now including Jin-ho in their pictures, seeing him as someone who protected rather than threatened. Former rivals sat together, united in building something better than any of them had imagined possible. Keanu appeared on a large screen, filming commitments preventing physical attendance, but his presence felt through technology. He spoke in Korean about second chances, about how the strongest warriors were those who conquered themselves, who chose redemption when revenge would be easier. His smile carried the same gentle sadness from that first meeting, but now mixed with pride for what Jin-ho had accomplished. Min-jun stood beside his uncle, accepted into Seoul National University but spending weekends teaching martial arts to younger kids at the center. He had survived his kidnapping physically unharmed but emotionally changed, understanding how close he had come to becoming another casualty of a life he had not chosen. His presence reminded everyone why the transformation mattered, representing a generation that could grow up without fearing the shadows their parents had created. The poetry readings became a weekly tradition, former criminals and curious university students sitting together to explore words that offered different kinds of power. Jin-ho discovered he had a gift for teaching, for helping young men understand the emotions they had been taught to bury under bravado and violence. The same skills he had used to read enemies now helped him recognize pain in boys trying to act tough, fear in teenagers recruited by gangs, hope in fathers wanting better for their children. 1 year after that first meeting in the bookstore, Seoul's crime rate in Jin-ho's former territories had dropped by 60%. Not through police action but through opportunity, through jobs and education and the radical idea that people could change if given reason to believe in something beyond survival. The community center expanded to 3 locations, each one a beacon in neighborhoods that had known only darkness. Keanu returned to Seoul for the anniversary celebration, no longer a stranger but family in all the ways that mattered. He and Jin-ho sat in the courtyard where they had first truly talked, sharing tea and comfortable silence born from understanding. They had both known loss, both faced the choice between letting pain make them hard or letting it make them human. Together they had proven that kindness was not weakness but the greatest strength of all. This story teaches us that transformation is possible at any point in our lives, no matter how dark our past or how fixed our paths seem. Jin-ho had spent decades building an empire on fear, but one moment of genuine human connection opened a door to complete redemption. Keanu Reeves, despite having every reason to withdraw from the world after personal tragedy, chose to remain open and compassionate, touching lives in ways that rippled outward like stones in still water. Their unlikely friendship shows that we all have the power to see beyond surface differences, to recognize the humanity in others even when they have forgotten it themselves. The greatest courage is not in fighting our enemies but in conquering our own darkness and choosing to be the light others need. When we approach others with genuine kindness and without judgment, we create space for miracles. Min Jun's rescue was just the beginning. The real salvation came when an entire community chose hope over fear, proving that even the hardest hearts can learn to beat with compassion again.